episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another extremely fascinating guest helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us on many different fronts. We have the honor today of being joined by Dr. Shawna Pandya, who is a physician, Aquanaut, advanced diver, scientist/astronaut candidate with Project PoSSUM, a skydiver, a pilot in training, speaker, and martial artist. Dr. Pandya is also the Vice President of Immersive Medicine with the virtual reality healthcare company Luxsonic Technologies, Director of the International Institute of Aeronautical Sciences, PoSSUM Space Medicine Group, Chief Instructor of the Operational Space Medicine course, Director of Medical Research at Orbital Assembly Construction, another fascinating company endeavoring to build the world's first rotating space station with artificial gravity. She's additionally a clinical lecturer at the University of Alberta, a podcast host with the World Extreme Medicine WEMCast series, primary investigator for the Shad Canada-Blue Origin student microgravity competition, a member of Ascend 2021, Guiding Coalition, Life Sciences team lead for the Association of Spaceflight Professionals, sesional lecturer for the Technology for the Future of Medicine course at University of Alberta, and fellow of the Explorers Club. Dr. Pandya also serves as medical advisor to numerous space, medical, and technology companies, including Mission Space Food, Genesis, and Aquanaut, as well as the Jasper Dark Sky Festival Advisory Committee. She holds both a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and a medical degree from University of Alberta, a master's degree in space studies from the International Space University, and certification in entrepreneurship and graduate studies from Singularity University. Her publications include book chapters on space spin-offs for medical benefits, psychological resilience, and long-duration space flight. Her career trajectory was captured at the Ontario Science Centre and Canadian Women in Space exhibit, where she is permanently now exhibited alongside Dr. Roberta Bondar, the first Canadian woman in space, one of her idols growing up. Really a lot to talk about here. She's interned at both European Astronaut Center and NASA's Johnson Space Center, was part of the first crew to test the commercial spacesuit in zero gravity back in 2015. I could go on for about a half hour with this bio, but instead, welcome Dr. Shawna Pandya to the show. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ira, for having me. This is going to be fun. I know we're going to have lots to talk about.
Absolutely, absolutely. To start off, you built this fascinating career with extreme passion for what you say on your website, sort of looking at the extremes of humanity, surviving and thriving, and sort of involved in all sort of technological innovations and human knowledge that go along with tackling these major challenges. Take a few minutes and just go into a little bit further back in your background about how you started off in all this, everything from where you grew up, how you developed your broad interest in STEM, and what got you interested in this amazing domain.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so I was always a really ambitious kid. When I was 4, I wanted to be a transformer and, use my superpowers and save the world. And then I realized, well, that's not realistic. That's a silly 4-year-old's dream. So I thought, okay, let's be a superhero. And then the same realization hit that wasn't realistic. And so I grew up a little bit. I became 7 and I thought, okay, well, what's something you can actually do? And I thought, let's be a billionaire and let's use all my wealth to save the world, give people vaccines, end hunger. That you can't really go to school to be a billionaire. There's no degree in billionaireology. So I thought, okay, let's become a little bit less ambitious and do something more realistic. So by the time I was 9 and 10, I was obsessed with the night sky. I was really, wanted to be, like most kids, I wanted to be an astronaut. I did a lot of camping as a kid. I was exposed to these wonderful, beautiful scenic night skies away from the city lights where the spiral arms of the Milky Way would just leap out at you. And I thought, hey, that's where I want to be. And so that's the dream that stuck with me. And I also grew up in the 1990s, during the era of the second ever Canadian Space Agency astronaut selection. And that was when Dr. Roberta Bondar, the first female Canadian astronaut, flew to space. And I was incredibly inspired by that. And, I just looked at her resume and I thought, okay, well, she's Canadian, I'm Canadian, she's female, I'm female, she's a girl guide, I'm a girl guide. So, well, now all I need to do is go be a neuroscientist doctor and then go to space. And that's how it goes. And that's actually really what set my trajectory. I was tremendously inspired by that. And so that's what caused me to pursue my degree in neuroscience. That's what caused me to pursue a career in medicine. And that really, laid the foundations for what I did after high school. And it was, it's a little bit ironic because in pursuing that path towards medicine, space definitely took a back burner because medicine was incredibly competitive and still is incredibly competitive to get into. And it wasn't until it came time to apply to medical school that I realized that, well, hey, space is all about contingencies, and I need a contingency if I don't get into medical school. I need a plan B that, will let me still focus on what I love and that I'll be happy doing. And that's when I'd heard about the master's at the International Space University. And I thought, hey, maybe I should apply for that. And that was really, to my surprise, I got into both medical school and the master's program. And it was the best tough decision I had to make. And finally, I thought, why not do both? And I asked the faculty at my medical school for deferral, explaining what I wanted to do. And somehow they said yes, which, I'm incredibly grateful for, because they could have, in a parallel universe, maybe they said no. And that was the start of realizing that, oh my gosh, you can make space part of your career. At ISU, very interdisciplinary, very international. We learned all about, engineering related to space, transport, planetary geology, life sciences, and of course, space medicine. And that was where I did my internship at the European Astronaut Center's Crew Medical Support Office, and, really saw people putting space medicine into their everyday work and careers. And before long, so that was kind of like that glimpse into, oh my gosh, like, you can do this. You can make space and space medicine part of your life. And that was like that. Okay, keep that in mind, no matter what else happens. And then before long, it came time to wrap up the master's, come back to medical school. But by that point, I'd been bitten by the bug, and everything that came afterwards. I was constantly going to space conferences. I was, as a medical student, lucky enough to write my first book chapter on space medical technologies that impacted medical technology on Earth. I was lucky enough to conduct research on the NeuroArm, which is a robot that conducts brain surgery based off Canadarm Technologies. And so it's sort of like technology, innovation, space, all coming together. And so like they were, as busy as medicine gets, there were ways to keep that interest still going. And all of those experiences made me a more and more of a competitive candidate for other opportunities. So in my fourth year of medical school, I've been aware of this opportunity since high school, but I wasn't qualified until 10 years later. And that was to apply for the medical student clerkship, the aerospace medicine elective at NASA's Johnson Space Center. So then there was also, there was this constant battle between space or surgery, because at the same time I'd fallen in love with surgery, with neurosurgery, where there was that route of wanting to go back to neuroscience. And I actually trained as a neurosurgeon for a while before realizing this is very, very limiting and very different from everything else that I've done. So after 3 years into it, I switched to general practice, completed that, and now my life is a very cool blend of getting to mix my passions of medicine, space, and austere environments. So my current practice covers general practice, rural, emergency, women's health, and I'm very much a fan of wilderness medicine, extreme environment medicine, and I bring those practices into the space medicine course that I teach, for example. And it was when I had the freedom to go into family medicine and have a lot more time and scheduling flexibility that I started looking towards space again. So for those 3 years in neurosurgery, like, it was simply focused on neurosurgery. And so once I came back out into the world again, it was like emerging from hibernation, the sun was shining. And that's when I heard about things like Project PoSSUM and being a citizen scientist-astronaut candidate. And I applied to the program, and it was incredible. And we can certainly talk about that, because that's a conversation in and of itself. And you know, it was simply being flexible and looking for opportunity and realizing that, hey, some opportunities I'm not qualified for now, but maybe when the time comes, like that NASA internship, you know, I'll keep building up my skill sets, keep building up my experiences, and throw my hat in the ring. And that explains a lot of how I've gotten to where I am today.
Outstanding, really outstanding. And you know, it's when one looks at these topics, we don't see them. You know, when I'm looking up my family practitioner that I need to choose here, you don't normally see things like extreme medicine, wilderness medicine, of course, space medicine on the summary, but clearly. You are laying the groundwork, not just in preparing yourself, but for all others, whether we're talking about the realities of life on the space station, the moon, Mars, beyond. Can you take us on a little bit of a sort of an introduction about what one studies in space medicine? You know, obviously a little later on, we'll get into a chat about zero gravity, which you spend a lot of time in, but obviously out there in the cosmos are all sorts of radiation and of course, isolation and different issues. Talk a little bit about what you study in terms of space medicine, how long these disciplines have sort of been there, where the centers of excellence currently are. Walk us through that if you would.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when we talk about space, I'm often asked, you know, how is space medicine a field? And initially the ideas of space and medicine seem quite disparate until you realize that space is trying to kill you. And you've alluded to a lot of the major concerns of when we send humans to space. We're actually coming up on the 60th anniversary of human spaceflight with the April 12th flight of Yuri Gagarin. And you know, what we've learned from decades of human spaceflight, there's lots of factors to contend with. So to categorize them, we're going to use the NASA Big Five classification, but it's essentially what you talked about. It's micro and altered gravity environments. So it might be zero gravity on the International Space Station. It would be 1/6 gravity on the moon. Radiation, isolation and confinement, distance from Earth. We can talk about what that means. And then everything else that falls out under hostile environments. And so, you know, the further you go, the tougher it is. So right now we have the luxury of being relatively protected at the 400 kilometers, 250 miles above the Earth in the International Space Station, because we're within still the protective confines of the Van Allen belt. So speaking specifically to radiation, within a day, you're exposed to 250 times the amount of radiation that you and I are exposed to on a regular day at ground level, but we're still being protected from the high energy, ionizing energy radiation particles. And once you go beyond the Van Allen belts, those particles aren't filtered out anymore. And so suddenly you're exposed to 3 additional sources. You're exposed to galactic cosmic rays, solar particle events, what we commonly call solar flares, and particles that just aren't filtered out through the magnetosphere and Van Allen belt. So as you can imagine, by the time you go to the moon, well, that's another layer of complexity. And same with the journey to Mars. Mars is not close. Depending on the conjunction of the 2 planets, it would take 6 to 9 months to get there with current technology. So there's some estimations that say that that's the equivalent of having a whole body scan CT every 5 to 6 days. And I've even read some reports that suggest that 25% of the crew would go blind from developing cataracts on the way to Mars. So that's kind of not ideal if you're sending a crew to Mars to work. The other issue is light can only travel so fast. So I know there's some Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans out there listening. And there's that famous Douglas Adams quote that goes, "Space is big." So vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big. And that it's true. So when you're on the ISS, it's only 400 kilometers. The communication delay is negligible. You can communicate with Earth in near real time. By the time you go to the moon, it's about a 2.4 second round trip delay. And then by the time you go to Mars, depending on the conjunction again of the 2 planets, it's anywhere from 3 to 23 minutes one way. So now imagine you have a medical emergency on Mars, you're dealing with a cardiac arrest, massive hemorrhage. You don't have time to wait for 46 minutes for Earth to radio help back, because suddenly you're going to lose the patient. So these are just some of the challenges. And then, you know, when we talk about going to a new environment, sure, we've done microgravity pretty well for decades, whether it's through Skylab, Mir, Shuttle, ISS. But once you're back on firm ground in an altered gravity environment, speaking specifically to the moon, well, we talked about the radiation. There's also altered day-night cycles depending on where you choose to be on the moon. So 14 days of day, 14 days of night. And then there's the lunar dust. There's a lot of lunar dust. If you read the biomedical lessons from Apollo, there's hundreds of pages of documentation of saying, well, what went wrong in the Apollo era? And we know that that dust was responsible for clogging up, for example, the wrist joints in their EVA or extravehicular activity suits. We know that it's a skin and a lung irritant. So there's a lot of challenges to mitigate when we talk about sending humans to low Earth orbit, to the moon, to Mars and beyond.
And it's quite timely that just in the news a couple of days ago, obviously former NASA astronaut Scott Kelly came back from his year-long journey aboard the ISS, but they've been studying his sort of health ever since. And what we see now, even though he was prescribed multiple days of cycling and treadmill and resistant exercise in zero gravity, he still experienced significant heart atrophy. We're just learning about that, the shrinkage or whatever that went along with that. You are very focused on this theme of resilience, which I sort of term in general this ability of humans to bounce back from stuff that happens to them, whether it's zero gravity or other. You are looking at obviously physical resilience, but you also study psychological resilience, thinking about, as you were saying, these 9-month travel periods. And then also another part of what you do, reproductive and sexual sort of issues, resilience in long duration spaceflight. Could you walk us through a little bit of each of those on sort of what are the sort of the key issues that you are thinking about nowadays for, whenever we do head to Mars or beyond, that we have to have these things taken care of?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. So coming back to your initial point about the challenges of altered gravity, microgravity environments, you're exactly right that every single bodily system is affected by being in 0G. And you and I have the luxury of doing this interview in 1G, so we take a lot for granted. If I held out my hand in front of me and let it drop, it's going to drop due to 0G. If we were on the ISS, there would suddenly be this whole brain, eye, proprioceptor nerve mismatch, and our brains would be incredibly confused. There's been reports of astronauts who see an arm floating in front of them and say, "Whose is that?" Slap it away, only to realize it's their own. And that takes some habituation. And so coming back to what you were saying about the exercise regimen aboard ISS, we know that bones lose density at an accelerated rate. We know that muscles lose mass. And so the question is, how do we mitigate that? And it starts at selection. We're already selecting the healthiest of the healthy candidates. And then we're putting them on their own prehab program before they ever fly to space to build up their muscle mass and perform bone loading exercises. And then on the ISS itself, they actually perform up to 1.5 to 2 hours of a combined aerobic activity as well as resistive exercise every single day with 1 day off. And so the idea is by performing that cardiac activity or that cardiovascular activity, they're still doing some semblance of bone and muscle health maintenance. And so the question is, how do you do that in space? Like if you and I just ran on a treadmill in space, we would fly off. So they're actually strapping themselves in and then running on the treadmill. And then they also have the advanced resistive exercise device, the AREDS device. So that's based on resistive hydraulic pumps that allow them to actually lift weights and do squats and weight-based exercises in space. So then coming over to resilience, this is one of my favorite topics. And basically, as you say, I've written a book chapter on it. On resilience in austere environments. So whether it's ISS, whether it's Antarctica, military deployments, it's actually very cool in that resilience isn't an innate trait, it's a learned trait. So it's not that, you are more resilient than I am, or I'm more resilient than you. It's actually something that we can cultivate, that can be broken down into key components. And those components are basically positive social support, positive self-talk, impulse control, mental rehearsal, and breaking things down. And so if you can apply those to whatever hostile or austere environment that you're in, then you're actually more likely to do well in that environment. And it's an entire field to study, and there's actually a term for it, and it's called salutogenesis. And that's the psychology term for saying those who view these harsh environments as an opportunity to rise to the occasion. It's an opportunity for self-growth. It's a way to explore your own character and get to know yourself better. And so that's what we find from people who actually thrive in these environments. It's, why do people do crazy things like run ultra marathons? Because it's an opportunity to push their own limits. And that's what we see, whether we're talking about living in a submarine for 6 months or living on the ISS for 6 months. So in relating to your last point, talking about the challenges of sexuality and reproduction in microgravity. So, we have people like Elon Musk saying, well, we want to create settlements of humans on Mars. Well, if we're going to have settlements, that implies reproduction. So we should probably study that before we ever get to that point. And what we know from data from studies of all manner of organisms, wasps, zebrafish, rats, mice, from shuttle era, from previous experiments in microgravity, is that every single aspect of the reproduction cycle is affected. So whether we're talking about gamete production, fertilization, implantation, development, all of these, the data that we have at best suggests that we need more data. So for example, in neonatal mice, we found that there were difficulties or developmental issues with neuromotor and neuromuscular development, but they were transient. And so they passed, and these mice eventually developed normally. And then, I believe that was neonatal rats. And then in another case, they took wasps who had been flown to space, male wasps, and then they had them come back to Earth and then reproduce, and they found that their offspring died off at a higher rate than non-flown wasps. So, what's the story? Is it, can we reproduce in space or can we not? And then, what is the limit? If we can't do that in microgravity safely, well, is 1/6 gravity on the moon enough? Is 1/3 gravity on Mars enough? And what's the prescription, as we like to say? Is it how much gravity for what duration at what frequency in development? What's the gravity prescription that we need to actually make development work?
Really fascinating. What as we think of this theme of space medicine, and then as you were saying, the further out, well, obviously the space is trying to kill us. The further we get out, it tries to kill us even more. I had the opportunity to spend a little time on recent episodes. I was talking to Dr. Tim Lasky at Medtronic, who's studying hibernation in bears, and trying to sort of understand how a bear can fall asleep for a very long period of time but maintain its cardiac health. I also did a really interesting interview a couple of years ago on the topic of tardigrades, which are sort of on the resilience spectrum, are one of those extremely resilient organisms on this planet. Any interesting research that you're doing on sort of these, what we'll call sort of the extremophiles, sort of the some of these superhuman capabilities that other non-humans have on this planet that are useful in some of the things you're studying for thinking about sort of beyond?
Yeah, not me personally, but what I like to say is that, if you can dream it, someone's out there working on it. And so to your point about human hibernation, there's multiple entities working on that. And the European Space Agency in 2019 actually conducted a study and said, well, if it's going to be so long to Mars, what if we just hibernated our astronauts and then woke them up 3 weeks before arrival? And what they calculated is actually they could get away with using 1/3 less volume in the spacecraft. And that's huge because space is incredibly hard and expensive. And so if you can save on your volume budget, you can save on the amount of resupply for food, for water, for oxygen, that's really valuable. And so I read about another comparative physiology institute. It's the Alaskan Arctic Biology Institute, and they're doing the same thing. And they're saying, okay, well, if ground squirrels can hibernate, can we take that capability and bring it to non-hibernating animals? And so they actually got rats, which don't typically hibernate, to hibernate and reduce their metabolic load and usage by 99%. They just ran into the small problem that these rats were getting gut ischemia, perforation, and sepsis. So they still need to solve that problem, because that would be a no-go in humans. But it's really fascinating. You know, there's so many fascinating areas of science fiction that we should be looking to you know, take on really hard problems. And so, for example, there was a 2017 article in the MIT Review that was called Engineering the Perfect Astronaut. And it's like, for those of us who grew up in the 90s, we may be familiar with the movie Gattaca, you know, where they genetically augmented humans, and then there were the haves and the have-nots, and, you know, it was this ethical quandary. And then the article poses the question, well, if you're knowingly sending humans into this high risk, high radiation, ultra-gravity environment, do you not have a duty to genetically modify them to protect them against this environment? And so what the experiment that they were conducting was looking at was starting less ambitiously and splicing elephant genes into a banana. And it's sort of like, well, why do you want to do that? And the answer is elephants don't get cancer. Why is that? They have 4 copies of the P57 cancer editing gene. And so now imagine you could successfully splice those genes into a human without making them into an elephant, then you're making them more radiation resistant. Other ideas that are on the horizon, so things that I love, you know, from The Matrix, where Neo is suddenly becoming a martial arts master by just uploading information, downloading information to his brain. And we know that skills deterioration is one of the stated risks for long duration missions to Mars. And so say you're a medical officer, you learn how to first insert an IV on Earth, and then you don't practice that skill until 9 months later on Mars. Your patient is going to look like a pincushion by the time you figure out how to start an IV. And so that's actually one of the things that we're doing with Luxsonic, is that we've created a VR medical skills suite so that you can practice inserting an IV in VR, so you're maintaining that motor memory. And we were actually developing a sepsis scenario for the Canadian Space Agency for exactly this purpose, for exploration class missions. And then the final example I want to talk about is Orbital Assembly Corporation. And so we've all seen Space Odyssey 2001. We've seen The Martian with these rotating artificial gravity space stations, you know, mitigating some of the challenges that we've talked about. And that's, you know, that's what we're proposing to do. We're not just going to be a commercial platform, but a research platform that, you know, solves a lot of these questions. Like, how much gravity is enough gravity? And, you know, is it enough to mitigate, you know, the bone loss, the muscle density? It could make for a far more comfortable journey to Mars, for example. It can make space more palatable for those of us who are not just astronauts, but the general population as well.
I'm going to require that because I get motion sickness on the Tilt-A-Whirl at the amusement park. So you're going to have to fix that. But however, that being said, I noticed that, you know, in addition to, as we said at the beginning, in addition to your scientist-astronaut activities, you also are an aquanaut, and you practice advanced diving and so forth. So I think sort of the universe, the oceanic domain is probably someplace I'll go before I get into space. But that being said, talk about what it means to be an aquanaut. Talk a little bit about what you've been doing on that front, and then how a lot of what, obviously that's not zero gravity, but all the stuff that you can learn in a extremely buoyant environment under strange pressures and austere environments translates a little bit to what you think about and experience as an astronaut candidate.
Yeah, you've hit it on the nail. And so when we talk about space, we say space is hard, space is expensive, and space is trying to kill us. So that means that we want to be as well rehearsed in as similar an environment as possible before we ever get to the real thing. And so that's where this concept of analog environments comes into play. We want an environment that is in some fashion analogous to the spaceflight environment. And so that's where a lot of the work that I've done in Mars simulations, in parabolic flight, and underwater missions comes into play. So I got my Aquanaut designation in 2019 on a 5-day underwater mission at the Jules Undersea Lodge in the East. And like a lot of what we deal with in space and exploration, that mission name's an acronym. So it was the Neptune mission, which stands for Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration. And basically over the course of 5 days, myself and my crew of 4 other members conducted research experiments in physiology, cognition, technology demonstrations, stress and cortisol levels, as well as sleep studies. And it was, you know, it really was an incredible lesson in teamwork, team dynamics, operational planning. It was isolated and confined in that anytime we wanted to go outside the habitat, we had to suit up as if we were going on an EVA or extravehicular activity. And in this case, our surroundings was water, so we would have to suit up in our dive gear. You know, and it was really a lesson in being sufficient as a team. Doing the planning for contingencies. And this is, you know, this is just one example of an underwater habitat. So actually just 13 miles down the road from Jules is the Aquarius Reef Base, where NASA runs its NEMO, or NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations missions. And they send their astronauts and scientists down for 8 to 16 days at a time. And this is where your question of pressure comes into play. So at the Jules Undersea Lodge where we were essentially at 20 feet surface pressure. So if there's a fire in the HAB, we can actually swim straight up to the surface. We don't have to worry about decompression. Those of your audience who may be divers know that once you go beyond a certain depth, you have to safely decompress. And that's the case at the Aquarius Reef Base. And so the reason you have to decompress is nitrogen bubbles in your blood dissolve and they go into solution. And if you go to a higher pressure too quickly, they come out too quickly and lodge in places that are bad, like your brain or your lungs or heart, causing things like pulmonary emboli, seizures, and even death, which is bad. You want to avoid that. So even though you're only 13 miles apart, at Aquarius Reef Base, you're 50 feet below the water. That means once you're in saturation, you have to decompress for 15 hours and 47 minutes. Unless you want to risk a dive injury. So for comparison, if you have a medical emergency or you need to evacuate the ISS, from the time you hit the evacuation button and escape into a Soyuz capsule and get to definitive medical care in Kazakhstan, you can get there in as little as 3.5 hours. You can get to medical care more definitively from the International Space Station than you can from Aquarius Reef Base. So again, you're really replicating that fidelity of being remote, resource limited, isolated, confined, being self-sufficient, replicating the risk factor. And then of course, there's, as you say, the physiological observations that you notice in that altered pressure environment. So even at Jules Undersea Lodge, we noticed silly things, simple things that like bags of marshmallows we brought down with us would come down compressed, or that the foam in our flip-flops would be compressed. And you know, it was really interesting because you didn't anticipate that necessarily at 20 feet, but it was noticeable.
Shawna, you know, aside from everything you do that we've been talking about, you also spend time not just practicing, but competing in both Taekwondo and Muay Thai kickboxing. I was wondering if you could just talk for a couple of minutes about your martial arts training, and I think I read that you compete every year in some competitions. At the same time, I'm just interested. I don't know if you had a chance to see a couple of our early shows. We had MMA legend Ken Shamrock on, who competed into his late 50s. We also have a boxer by the name of Moises Fuentes, who was coming back for a second career. I'm just very interested, coming back to sort of this theme of resilience. Your thoughts from a clinician's perspective on sort of the tools, whether they be psychological or some regenerative medicine tools that we're beginning to see, and taking some of these athletes and making them more resilient, let's say, in sort of later parts of their careers or for second careers. If you could just talk for a couple of minutes about those topics, I think they're awesome.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. So I have a whole TED talk on resilience, and one of the lessons that I talk about is what I've learned from martial arts. I've been practicing martial arts for 20 years. And some years, it ebbs and it flows. Some years you do the bare minimum because you're busy training for medicine. And, other years I've been lucky enough to compete at the international level, at Worlds. And so, your martial arts family, when you find the right one, is like your other family. And you can always keep coming back. And in the place where I trained for Taekwondo, I'm a second Dan black belt now. We have these fundamental tenets of Taekwondo, and every single person who comes to the club, every new student, young or old, is taught the same thing. And those tenets are courtesy, integrity, perseverance, self-control, indomitable spirit. And my favorite two are indomitable spirit and perseverance. And we had this sign on our club wall that said, "Fall down 7 times, get up 8." And this is really, this is a theme that's universal, I think, in martial arts. So the other part of my martial arts journey has been training in Muay Thai. As you said, for a number of years, I would go annually to fight camps in Muay Thai to train. And in one of the places that I trained, there was a quote on the wall that's often attributed to Winston Churchill, but it's actually, it's unattributed once I looked in the source, but it says, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It's the courage to go on that counts." And so the common theme is, you're going to fail, you're going to have bad fights, you're going to lose, but as long as you're breathing, you still have a pulse. You can get back up. You can dissect what you did. You can figure out what went wrong, what went right, and what you're going to do the next time. And it's the same in, it's not just martial arts. Any operational, any high, rapidly changing environment, you want to adopt that mindset. And part of the, the key that I've learned to really help learn and grow from mistakes and reinforce positive patterns is something we do in aviation and microgravity campaigns and skydiving, and it's learning the art of the debrief. Whether things go well or things go wrong, you want to go through that sequence of events, event by event, and say, "Hey, this went well, I'm going to do this next time. This didn't go so well, this is how I'll be prepared or avoid it altogether next time." So resilience, preparation, and then just having the discipline to dissect your own actions is really key in any operational environment.
Just a couple wrap-up questions here. Shawna, typically I get contacted after I do these shows, and I really know it's going to happen with this one. It's sort of the younger generation listening, sees everything you've done. They want to follow in your footsteps. They want to be the next Dr. Shawna Pandya. Take a couple minutes. I know you go out. You're very active, sort of in the STEM arena and education. For sort of the next generation that's coming along, someone that's in their senior year of high school or just starting off in college, some suggestions into sort of how they follow in your footsteps to do what you do.
Oh gosh, yeah. So the number one thing to realize is, now is your time. This is the best time in humanity to become involved. Right now, I'm involved with mentoring several high school groups involved with payloads that are developing payloads for microgravity through PoSSUM 13 and through the Shad Canada-Blue Origin microgravity campaign. And so, first of all, now is your time. And then the second thing to realize is that if you have a dream, just work really, really hard to get there. Develop a work ethic, because that's free. You don't have to be born more hardworking than someone else. That's something that you develop on your own. And then don't let anyone tell you you don't belong here. This is the time that we're trying to level the playing field. We have 12% of women who've been astronauts. We need to change that. Women are underrepresented in STEM at the space agency level. We need to, we're here to lift you up. So if you have a dream, if you want to be part of the space sector, there's space for all of us. Act like you belong here, because you absolutely do.
Great message. Final question. We're a couple of years out now. We have perfected space medicine, maybe some hibernation, your artificial gravity, and so forth. If I could, snap my fingers and the money came down from the heavens, and I can send Dr. Shawna Pandya anywhere in the solar system, are there particular places you're extremely interested in going and experiencing, whether it be the moon, Mars, moons of Saturn, wherever, that that really, hey, I think there's something cool there that I need to get to and see in my life.
Yeah, so if Mars and the moon were out of the question, say we'd learned somehow everything there was to learn about those environments, I would go to the ice worlds of Jupiter and Saturn. So I'd want to go to Titan, Enceladus, Europa, see what's lurking there. When we didn't even get to the question, sorry, I didn't answer your question about thermophiles and extremophiles, but as the Jurassic Park quote goes, life finds a way. And I'd love to see if we can have organisms habitating at the deepest depths of our ocean around geothermal vents. Let's see where else they may end up in similar locales elsewhere in the solar system.
Absolutely. Shawna, it's been really fascinating talking to you and hearing about your journey, and just really wishing you the best with all of this moving forward. It's an amazing portfolio, and just, it's going to be fun watching you move forward with all of this for all of us in the coming years. For everybody that's going to be listening on the podcast or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to the amazing Dr. Shawna Pandya, scientist, physician, astronaut candidate, Aquanaut speaker, martial artist, skydiver, pilot in training, vice president in immersive medicine at the Luxsonic Technologies, director of medical research at Orbital Assembly Construction. Once again, the list goes on and on. Shawna, it's a really pleasure having you today. Really wishing you the best with all of this. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show. Thank you for what you're doing. And as we say on this show, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow through what you're doing. It's really so inspiring.
Thank you so much for having me, Ira. It was my extreme pleasure.